Hello everybody, this is Jasmina, and in this video I'm going to talk about some real scientific studies that involve Qi and Feng Shui. I will be the first to admit I am very happily wrong about this. There are now studies that look into the effects of both Feng Shui and Qi. When I started Feng Shui, there were none, at least none I could find. So both Qi, whether you spell it with a CH or a Q, is the same thing. And Feng Shui, there have been quite a few recent studies that are using reasonably scientific methods to test these. Now, all studies have limitations. All scientific studies do, so that's not really an issue. Everything has limitations when it comes to science. And you just have to keep adding up data after data until you actually get an answer. And of course, more research is needed, but the results are encouraging. And all the papers also recognize that more research is needed. When I first started studying Feng Shui in the mid-1990s, I did briefly look up to see if there were scientific studies, and there weren't any. But now there are. So there are 4 studies I'm going to concentrate on in this presentation. And this one is the only one that has to do directly with Qi. The rest of these have to do, at least in part, with Feng Shui. Interestingly, at least to me, the scientific assessments of Feng Shui, especially Feng Shui, has increased significantly since 2017. And that happens to be when the Shun Kong period 9 began. Now remember, there are 2 different calendars. However, I would also say this has probably a lot more to do with COVID than it has to do with the fact that we changed the calendar. So this paper here looks at a literature review. So they look through all the papers that are out there and they summarize things. And one of the things they looked at was the number of papers coming out. And between 2002 and 2016, on average, 4 papers concerning Feng Shui were published. But since 2017, until end of last year, it has quadrupled. It's up to 16. But there was a very significant increase with COVID. But when you look at it as a kind of a whole line thing, it's actually pretty clear that this is there is a trend here. It's not, there's a little bounce like there's always in data, but there's clear trend. So the first study I looked at was one that looked at using Qi, as in terms of Qigong masters, to see what effects they could have on cancer cells. And what they did is they looked at pancreatic cancer cells and normal cells outside the body. So these are like in petri dishes. And Qigong masters would come and give a treatment like they would to a human, but to these petri dishes. What they found is Qigong did result in the death of some of the cancer cells without harming the normal cells. Now, it didn't eradicate cancer, but sometimes it made a significant drop in the number of cancer cells. Now, this isn't the only papers about Qi. In fact, there have been quite a few more about Qi than there have been about Feng Shui. And they've started earlier too, started before the turn of the 21st century. But, and they've been studies that look at what can Qigong do to properties of water, and what can they do to solutions of with water, the properties of that, because the human body is made out of a lot of water. But even though we actually have some idea what Qigong does to water and to cells, we still really have no definitive idea of exactly what Qi is. We still don't know. Now, I will say this, these studies are fairly preliminary and nothing is considered proven. And if you've ever talked to someone who actually does medical studies that, look into medications and other treatments, they will tell you what works in a petri dish may not work in humans, or what works in curing cancer in mice doesn't always work in humans. So there's nothing definitive here. However, by looking at this study, if I were to be unfortunate enough to get cancer, I would probably choose Qigong to help the Western medications that they would give me. Now, the other of these three focus on Feng Shui. And I'll just, they have to do with sleep quality, with dementia, and general quality of life. Now, the first one, and this is the one I consider to be, let's say, the most thoroughly done in terms of science. Now, I have done scientific research. I have a PhD, so I'm not talking like a layperson. I'm talking about the view as a scientist when I talk about this. Now, this is a PhD dissertation, and so it tends to be quite intense. Now, on page 213 of this dissertation here, and you can get this online for free if you work hard enough, and that's what I did. It looks at the quality of sleep, and what they found was that for good sleep quality, you want to have your headboard against a solid wall, and that's solid from floor to ceiling. They also looked at other things that can negatively affect your sleep. The worst thing that they found was sleeping with a window behind your headboard, and I think that means either directly behind or above your headboard, so that you don't have that solid wall from floor to ceiling. Also, sleeping in line with the door was found to be second worst, and in what I could see in the dissertation is they actually had the headboard facing the door, not against the door, but facing the door, not the foot of the bed facing the door, the other way around. Also, mirrors that were pointing at the bed so that you could see yourself or see part of the bed, that was a negative. And then finally, sharp corners pointing at the bed. Now, this sharp corner can come from a table, or it can come from an interior corner of a room, but this is the one that has the least effect, and it wasn't very strong. This one was significantly strong. Now, the one thing I really liked about this is that they had the same people use different room arrangements alongside a control group where nothing was changed. And that's a good way of doing this, is that you're taking the same person and putting them under different conditions, and you have a control group that you can look at that gives you an overall effect of whatever else is happening in the world. Now, the second paper looked at really scientific instruments that are claimed to do biocommunications, and it's by a certain company, which I am not going to mention, but I think there's a decent chance that that company paid for this research. And so in this case, rooms were not changed, but they were assessed for quality of feng shui and put in different groups. That is, from worst feng shui to best feng shui. Now, this company has instruments that they say measure the biofields in a room, and then they, with what measurements they have, they create what they call treatments that is supposed to balance or do something to the biofields that it makes you basically to have better sleep. This is another one about sleep. And when all the stuff was done, all the analysis was done, and this is double blind, which is the good way to do it, it was found that feng shui arrangement was more important than any of this company's biofield treatments. So I have a feeling that this company is not going to fund any more research, at least not by this individual. Then there was another study which is a much lower quality in terms of proving feng shui, but it assessed several live-in care facilities in New Zealand for people with various types of dementia. And they looked at a lot of different factors. Feng shui was one. The way the staff interacted with the patients was another. And there were a couple other factors too. Now, they did come up with some feng shui recommendations that they said should help, but they didn't really separate feng shui from everything else. And so this one is let's say, um, the least strong study that's out there. Although it is a very important study still, because having a supportive environment for people with dementia can be quite hard. There's another study which is also quite interesting, and it looks, at least the abstract states, it looked at a correlation between the quality of overall feng shui in the house and the quality of life of the women who spend most of their time in the house. That is, they don't have outside jobs, or at least not even half-time jobs. Unfortunately, the rest of the paper is in Arabic, so I can't read it, so I can't really tell you exactly what it says. And there's not any tables that I can read either. Now, I've had friends in the past who do read Arabic. Unfortunately, I've lost touch with them during COVID, so I'm trying to get back in touch with them and see if they can help me with this, but they're a bit hard to find. Now, here again, I'm talking as a scientist or a former scientist. There are always issues in every single scientific study out there, but once you get enough people, different people, doing similar studies or looking for similar effects, this is how you get scientific consensus. One of my biggest, I guess, concerns or complaints about these studies is most of the time the sleep quality was self-assessed. Now, I do know there are instruments that can assess sleep quality, but they're not cheap equipment, I assume, and also you have to be trained to be able to use them properly. And that can add quite a bit of money, or quite a bit of needed money, to a research project. And it's very hard to get money for research, despite what you may think. It's very hard because there are a lot of very good studies out there in all kinds of different sciences that don't get funded because there simply isn't the money for them. So the other issue I have is that some of these studies had a relatively small number of participants, so that means the uncertainty is quite a bit greater. Some of the studies did not isolate the effects of feng shui, so it's hard to say what they really are seeing in their study. But I will also say this, I have never worked on human studies. I've always worked on things where you have an instrument take your measurements, and then you analyze what readings the instrument had taken. Human studies really are not that easy. Oftentimes they're quite a bit more expensive because, first off, you tend to have to pay people to stay in the study because otherwise, the life will get busy, and unless they have an incentive, they're going to drop out. And I think that's pretty common. So it makes it more expensive. So that makes it harder to fund. And the other thing I worry about in this case, because they don't have the scientific instruments, it's possible the self-assessments may only be exhibiting the placebo effect. And you would have to use these scientific studies in a place that maybe knows a lot less about feng shui. And for people who don't know anything about feng shui, then you might actually be more reassured that the results of these studies are good. Now, all of these studies that I've talked about here, and in all of the studies I've looked at, they are cognizant of these shortcomings. They know these are shortcomings. But the nice thing is they do see some positive effects of good feng shui arrangements. So there is slowly a consensus building. When it comes to a type or quality of study, there are two general things, and this works in all of science. First thing you do is what is called a qualitative study. So you're saying, does this thing affect that outcome? Basically, that's what we're talking about. So you're trying to see whether if you do something, something else happens. And it's as simple as that, yes or no. Then there's something called quantitative, and this is where you get detailed numbers. For example, you can say if you get X amount of radiation of this type, you have Y amount or percentage more chance of getting cancer. That is a number and a number. You actually be able to give a detailed number. Where we are in Feng Shui is still qualitative. So the effects of Qi and Feng Shui, by looking at these studies, are more likely to be real than not real, but how strong the effects both of these have is simply not clear enough yet. We cannot make a definitive quantitative statement. So I'd like to thank you for watching. Please feel free to contact me here if you have any questions or visit my ad-free website. You can also subscribe because I will be having new videos on a fairly regular basis, and I will have new monthly updates and even yearly updates for certain important things. Thank you again for watching.